Hello, and welcome to another edition of FNR Ask the Expert. As per usual, we're going to be answering all of your questions about a variety of topics, and today it just happens to be the cicada. And there's a lot of confusion about cicadas, whether we're talking about the ones you see every summer or this brood X emergence you may have heard of that's coming in the coming weeks. So we want to clear all of that up for you today. And we're joined today by exotic forest pest educator, still the best name ever, Elizabeth Barnes, and Purdue Extension wildlife specialist, Jared Brook, and also Purdue Extension forester, Lenny Farley. Now, you may ask, why do we have an insect expert, a forest expert, and a wildlife expert? Well, cicadas have their hands or sounds in a little bit of everything. So we're going to talk about the biology of these critters, what makes them different from the ones you see every year just hanging out in your backyard, and also how these things can affect, this big emergence can affect your trees, shrubs, and wildlife. So to get us started, I'm going to throw it to Elizabeth. First of all, if you have questions, please put those in the comment section on Facebook, and I'm sure you will have a ton of them. But Elizabeth is going to get us started with just explaining briefly about the cicada, maybe some myths of you've heard it wrongly named, and just what is the difference between the garden variety cicada and this emergence that we're discussing. So Elizabeth, without further ado, take it over.
Great, thank you, Wendy. I'm going to share my screen really quickly because I think it's easier to illustrate a lot of this with images, and I'll go through just some really quick biology about the cicadas and then show you the differences between the annual cicadas versus the 17-year cicadas that we're expecting to come. I always do that. There we go. So the cicadas, they have a 17-year-long life cycle, most of which they spend underground where they feed on roots. They're not actually damaging the roots. They're actually just drinking from them. They emerge when the weather is about 64 degrees Fahrenheit, usually in ground temperature in May to June after a warm rain. And so honestly, I'm kind of wondering here in Tippecanoe County, I know the cicadas are up close to the surface. They have been for a while now. Just got some rain. Maybe we'll start seeing some cicada soon. There can be up to 1.5 million per acre. So it is hard to ignore when they are there. They climb up into the trees, sing to find mates, lay eggs in branches. They then hatch in the branches, fall to the ground, and the cycle repeats again. They are found throughout all of Indiana, but the largest populations are in southern Indiana. They used to be found in larger populations throughout the entire state, but due to land use changes over time, they are now restricted to smaller areas in the state. This is because they really need to be feeding on trees for that full 17-year-long life cycle. So if you remove the trees, even if you plant a new tree at the end of the summer, again, it's too long for the cicadas. A month is too long for them not to be eating, and you will lose the cicada population in that area. They also don't travel very far, so the adults travel about 50 meters at the most. And so you can imagine for the cicadas to repopulate an area, they come up out of the ground every 17 years. They can maybe move in another 50 meters, and then it's another 17 years before they can move an additional 50 meters. So that's why it's taking so long. Just a few things to anticipate. The first thing you'll probably notice are these holes in the ground and these mud chimneys. These, again, were taken about a week and a half ago in West Lafayette. And sometimes if you look down into them, you can see the little cicadas waiting at the surface with their bright red eyes. Then you will encounter the shells. So they molt out of their nymphal stage, and they leave behind these exuvia or cicada shells. Something I always like to point out to people is if you see this like little white stuff on there, that is actually a remnant of the lungs of the insect, which I think is super cool. They will be noisy. That's the next thing you'll notice. Luckily, they're only singing during the day, so at night you'll be able to get some sleep, or at least you can't blame it on the cicadas if you can't get some sleep. They also, when they die, their bodies fall to the ground and they decay, and they will help to fertilize the understory. And there's sort of mixed data about whether or not they give the trees a boost as well, but that's a possibility too. And I won't get into this because We have another expert here, but I just love this picture so much that I wanted to share it to give you a little preview of the cicada feeding frenzy. So some people ask the question, all right, so we see these things every year. We see cicadas every year. What's the big deal? Why is this so exciting? There are actually different species of cicadas. So the cicadas that we see most years are the annual cicadas. They come out in August. They're more of this green color with a little bit of brown. They're a little bit wider and a little bit bigger versus this year, in the spring, we are seeing the emergence of the 17-year cicada, which is actually a group of 3 species of cicadas. These ones look very different. They have dark bodies, bright red eyes, and golden colored wings. Think of it as the difference between a goose and a cardinal. They're both birds, but they do very different things. In this case, they're both cicadas, but they do very different things, come out at very different times of year. Another common question we get is about, is this a plague of locusts? No. So particularly in the Midwest, people use the word locust and cicadas interchangeably a lot. Locusts are not cicadas. They are very different insects. They have very different mouth parts. So they do different types of damage. Cicadas have piercing, sucking mouth parts. Locusts have chewing mouth parts. So damaging different plants in different ways. And I'm almost done, I promise. So I just wanted to address this question as well about whether or not they're dangerous. They don't bite, they don't sting, they're not poisonous. But as with anything, if you encounter them, do consult a vet or a doctor if you're at all concerned. We can't predict every interaction people are going to have with cicadas. So there's always an off chance that, say, your pet will eat a cicada and be allergic to it. So if it starts acting weird or you're worried, consult a vet. But inherently, cicadas don't bite, sting, and they're not poisonous. And I'm happy to, I don't know if you want me to talk about cicada food or if I can also wait until somebody has questions about that.
Why don't we talk a little bit about the dangers of the cicadas, and then we'll come back around to the food since it's a much more positive topic. So Lenny, I'm going to toss it to you. One of the things she mentioned is these things like to eat a lot, and they lay eggs in trees. So certainly that's an area of concern. So what can these cicadas, what damage can they cause to my trees and shrubs, and how can I help protect them?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating area. For 17 years, these cicadas are underground, feeding essentially on the juices from tree roots. So that's how they make their living, and that's why if we lose the trees, we lose the cicadas. They're dependent upon that. And it's a relationship that's been going on for millennia. And so our forests are really adapted to that predation. They do fine in that situation. It doesn't do a really significant amount of damage to our native trees. Once they come out of the ground, they're going to climb up into the trees and they're going to lay eggs. The females are going to lay eggs using a little ovipositor. It's almost like a little drill or needle that they wedge into small branches that are 3/16 of an inch to a 1/2 inch in diameter of a lot of different species of deciduous trees and shrubs. So they're not real selective on what they lay their eggs into. It goes into a lot of different species. And that's where some of the damage can actually occur. And so if we've got a lot of cicadas emerging, Elizabeth said maybe over 1 million per acre, that's pretty amazing. You've got the potential to have a lot of egg laying and therefore a lot of that insertion damage in those small twigs. And so what we see happen in the forest typically is what we call flagging. And that's where this damage has actually broken or separated the conductive tissues in the twigs such that those twig ends start dying. And they can break off, drop off, fall to the ground, or hang on the trees and brown out essentially, thus the name flagging. On large trees, not a big concern. This is like a light pruning that can happen. It's not going to have a big impact on the health of larger trees. On smaller trees, perhaps a tree that you planted in your yard that was a smaller seedling and it's maybe 1 to 3 or 4 years old, it can do some damage because you're going to lose some branch area. So you may want to consider some protective measures on some of those small trees that have been recently planted. And the recommendation is to use what was called insect netting. And insect netting is mesh that has less than a half-inch squares. Usually we're looking at 3/8-inch squares or smaller, that will prevent the cicadas from actually accessing those small branches. And so you put that netting over the top of your tree and bundle it on the trunk so the cicadas can't climb up underneath it. And you leave it there as long as the cicadas are out on the landscape, usually about a month and a half, so into June. And that's a really good protective measure for trees that you want to avoid getting damaged. There are insecticides that can be used, but they're not as effective as the netting, and they have to be applied typically twice a week to really do good protection. And you're oftentimes killing beneficial insects in the process. So we really don't recommend using those unless you're a professional orchard grower or nursery person and have to use them to protect a large area. I also get people asking about what we call conservation tree plantings, where we're planting 1 or 2-year-old seedlings in large numbers on large areas for reforestation and wildlife habitat. And there's really no practical method to keep cicadas from getting on those trees and doing damage. The good news is, in talking to a lot of seasoned foresters and tree planters who've experienced this before, is that it'll do some top damage to those trees, but in fact, they resprout from the root systems. And they have seen over long time periods, there's really no significant adverse effects, even though we get a little bit of top damage in those seedlings. So yes, we'll see some damage, but it's typically not a long-term problem.
So we had a question, are there specific trees and shrubs that are vulnerable that they should be concerned about, especially ones that have maybe just been planted?
Mostly it's more about size than species. The deciduous trees and shrubs in our area are almost all potential targets of cicada. It's more if you've got something in your yard or landscape or are looking to preserve some fruit production, those would be the trees that I would be looking at doing netting on. Otherwise, larger trees, probably not going to have a problem.
So we talked about some of the negative effects that it can have on our trees and shrubs, but Jared, this actually is a positive for much of our wildlife. So fill us in on maybe that smorgasbord that's out there for a variety of animals.
Yeah, so if you think about this little cicada that comes out of the ground in these huge quantities, 1.5 million per acre in the billions across the landscape, that creates an all-you-can-eat buffet for a lot of different wildlife species, and a whole host of different species will eat cicadas. So from snakes to birds to small mammals, fish, all those kinds of things, different species will eat cicadas. So they basically have an unlimited supply of food, and these cicadas are essentially defenseless. They don't have a lot of defenses. They emerge out of the ground. They're pretty slow moving. They crawl up a tree, so animals can eat them on the ground. And as they crawl up the tree, birds and snakes and other things can eat them as they crawl up the tree. So not a lot of defenses. Their defense is actually coming out in such large quantities. So by coming out in such large quantities, a certain proportion will be eaten by various wildlife species or die. But a large majority of those, because there's so many of them, will survive to lay eggs and create the next 17-year brood cycle. And so that's their defense. They don't have, bad taste or stingers or anything like that to help defend themselves. So they're pretty easy pickings for different wildlife species. And this is beneficial to wildlife for 2 main reasons. The first reason being it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. So there's been studies that have looked at different species of wildlife and how they respond after a cicada emergence. And in some bird species, you see larger clutch sizes, larger weights, higher survival in years when you have cicada emergence because they have this access to an abundant food source. The second main way that it impacts wildlife species, especially birds, is by what we would call alternative food or predator satiation. So if you think about this, a variety of wildlife species eat them, including predators like raccoons and other things. But raccoons also eat birds' nests that are on the ground. You have lots of things. Snakes eat birds' nests. So you have lots of things that are preying on eggs of birds and young of birds that may not allow those birds to reach adulthood. Well, in years where you have this huge cicada emergence, those predators like a raccoon, and in one study in Indiana, during an emergence year, 53% of raccoons' diets were cicadas. So they're preying heavily on cicadas. And in those years, they don't have to do as much searching for other food like birds' nests or young of birds or things like that. So they spend more of their time eating cicadas, less of their time searching for other foods, which can actually increase nest survival for various bird species. And we've seen this in the research, where in years of cicada emergence, you actually have increased nest survival because of that easy access to food, but also you have less predation on nests because these predators are satisfied. They're full on cicadas and not full on bird eggs. And then there's actually some really cool data that I've looked at from the Indiana DNR that shows also an increase in turkey poult or turkey young survival in the years of cicada emergence. And it's for the same reasons, right? Turkeys and turkey poults eat bugs. They almost eat exclusively bugs in the summer. So these cicadas are easy pickings. And then nest predators like raccoons, skunks, possums don't have to search to fill their bellies, so they can just eat cicadas and not eat young turkeys or poults. And then that actually translates into potentially more turkeys on the landscape in a year or two after the cicada emergence. One thing to keep in mind is this could potentially be a double-edged sword, though, because although birds' nest survival and brood survival may increase for a year or two following, or the year of following a cicada emergence, because predators also eat cicadas, their numbers can also increase in the years following cicada emergence. So you may have like waxing and waning predator prey populations, but overall it's a positive benefit, but it's more of an ephemeral pulse where we see an increase in populations or survival in the year or two following cicada emergence, and then it kind of goes back to normal after that.
So a lot of full bellies out there, and diets changing. So we'll see how that affects things. And Jared, as we move along, we're going to talk a little bit about how people can help track that, but we'll get to that a little bit later. We've had a few questions from the audience for Lenny. Lenny, first of all, woody shrubs. Do people need to worry about those? So I'll let you, and also since we're in the same vein, evergreen trees. So cover those two first, and then we've got another question as well.
So they target almost any deciduous woody plant potentially. So shrubs could also be at risk, but most of our deciduous shrubs are also excellent resprouters. So they've got a lot of potential to put up new growth if top growth is damaged. It's really an adaptation of being browsed. So it's kind of a question of how much effort you want to go to prevent any damage versus recognizing you could have some damage, but chances are those plants are going to recover pretty nicely. The conifer is a little less certain. These critters really kind of tune in on the deciduous hardwoods, but if they're really in high numbers, it might not be impossible to get a little bit of conifer damage, but that's really not where they want to be, partly because conifers have some defense mechanisms with pitch and other things that they exude out of their twigs that can be problematic for these insects. So the primary risk is to the deciduous hardwood and woody shrubs.
And then secondly, Chris has a question. He has a number of young trees from local nurseries and big box stores. He's concerned what the age of those would be, and if he should be concerned about them being vulnerable.
Once again, kind of an evaluation of how much outer branches he'd be willing to lose to the cicadas doing damage, but an established tree will typically recover and regrow branch area. So it's kind of that evaluation of how much work do you want to do to completely eliminate damage versus accepting a little bit of temporary damage that the trees are going to recover from. So it's a calculation of how much work you want to go to make sure you don't have any problems versus living with a little bit of a problem for 1 year and then typically seeing a pretty good recovery.
Just a reminder, if you have more questions, those have all been great questions, put those in the comment section on Facebook. I'm going to throw it back to Elizabeth. She's going to talk to us a little bit about some fun side, I guess you will, of cicadas. And we know what cicadas like to eat, and now we know what likes to eat cicadas from Jared's point of view, but can we eat cicadas, Elizabeth?
Yeah, so there's actually a really long history of people eating both the nymphs and the adult cicadas. Going back as far as we have both oral and written histories, there are stories about people eating cicadas. Sometimes this was because people just needed something to survive off of, and so they were eating the cicadas. Sometimes it's as a treat. So really for a lot of different reasons. As I mentioned, they're not poisonous, and honestly, they're pretty tasty. There are a lot of good recipes out there for eating cicadas. You can essentially do what you would do with a shrimp, you can do with a cicada. Plus, you can put cicadas in sweet things as well to add a little bit of a crunchy texture. I do want to mention, though, there are a few things that you should be careful about. First, if you are allergic to shellfish, you want to avoid cicadas as well. People who are allergic to shellfish are usually also allergic to insects because they're pretty closely related. So a lot of the allergens are the same for both. The second thing is you want to be careful about which cicadas you're actually picking to eat. You want to get healthy cicadas. You want to get cicadas that haven't been contaminated with anything else. You do want to get the live cicadas. So you want to collect live cicadas, bring them back, freeze them, and then cook them. Some people have said like, oh, well, there's a bunch of dead ones on the ground. Can I just pick those up and eat them? That's easier to gather. And no, don't do that. You don't know what killed them. You don't know how long they've been there. So that's not a great idea. But it's kind of essentially the same thing as anything that you're gathering from the wild. We want to encourage people to have fun with it, but at the same time, be cautious about what you're actually eating and what you're actually consuming. We don't want anyone accidentally eating pesticides, for example. So if a tree is treated with insecticides and then the cicada feeds on the tree and then you eat the cicada, you're consuming those insecticides, and that can be a potential issue. But if you're just be careful about it, and if you feel off or sick afterwards, consult a doctor, of course, as with anything that you're taking from the wild. Also, before we switch back, I wanted to also mention, if you don't want to actually eat cicadas themselves, but you want to have some sort of food celebration, the entomology department is hosting a cookie decorating contest. So you can make any kind of cookies. It doesn't have to have insects in it. I mean, it can if you want, but it doesn't have to. And then if you decorate them like a cicada, send us a picture and you can win some kind of fun prizes from that.
And the link to the cookie contest is in the comment section on Facebook. So I encourage you to get in on that action. You don't have to eat the bugs. You can just decorate cookies to look like bugs. But if you want to go for it, we do have some recipes for some cicada cookies, I believe, on the Cicada website, and I'll post that here in a second. We have more questions for Lenny. Lenny, apparently people are very worried about their trees. How soon do they need to cover their vulnerable species? And I guess that kind of goes back to all of you, is when is this actually happening, and how do we know when they're actually coming out to get us?
I'm going to let Elizabeth double check me on this, but I'm going to say imminent. If we get a warm up, it could be any time. And so now's the time to be locating your insect netting and getting it on your trees.
Yeah, I agree with that. We're starting to see those holes in the ground, in the chimneys. They've been out waiting in the ground for a few weeks now. And we're, at least again here where we are in West Lafayette, we've been getting a warm week. And so they're really just waiting for it to be just warm enough and to get a warm rain. My prediction, and every other entomologist I've talked to's prediction, is that in the next week, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks if we have a huge cold snap, but more likely in the next week to 2 weeks, we're going to start seeing those cicadas coming up out of the ground and emerging.
Wendy, I should mention that folks need to recognize we're not going to have cicadas everywhere. As Elizabeth's already talked about, if an area has historically not had forest in it, chances are you're not going to have much of a cicada emergence in that location. And if you've got questions, find somebody in your neighborhood who's been there for more than 17 years and ask them, was there cicadas in 2004? If they weren't there then, chances are they won't be there now.
So we have a question just came in from Sonia, and this, I guess, is for Elizabeth and Lenny, another tree question. Does it make sense to simply watch smaller or newer trees each day? And if so, then pull off the cicadas that might be laying eggs, or does the process happen so quickly once the cicadas get there that you can't prevent the damage?
Elizabeth, you want to try that one? I'm not sure how to answer it, to be honest.
Sure. I would be hesitant to use the just like pulling the cicadas off method, because even though they're not going to move very far within a small area, you can get more cicadas kind of jumping between trees and hopping on. They can fly. They're bad flyers. They're very clumsy, but they can fly, and they do fly. So I think in order to prevent any damage, if that's what you're concerned about, you'd have to basically be sitting there all day pulling the cicadas off. I think it would be much more effective to put those bags on the trees and just that mesh to cover it. Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that you would get every cicada off if you were trying to pick them off.
And nobody wants to sit there and pull cicadas off a tree all day.
No. I mean, so I would love to sit out there and watch cicadas all day, but that's because I'm a weird bug person. So I think most people probably do not want to sit there staring at their trees looking at the cicadas all day.
So if you're a weird bug person, call Elizabeth, have a party, and pull off cicadas. Otherwise, go for the mesh netting. It's way easier, way more cost effective, and way more time effective. I do want to hop back to Jared a little bit. You mentioned that this is going to affect wildlife not just this year, but in the coming years. How can we help kind of track that response?
Yeah, so one of the easiest ways is, if you're interested in wildlife response, especially if you're interested in things like turkeys, each summer the Indiana DNR does a turkey brood survey where they ask people around the state just to report to them if they see turkeys, hen turkeys, with broods or without broods, so with or without young, basically from the month of July through the month of August. And that helps them track turkey brood production every year. So they do this every year. And then if we keep doing that and we do it through these years of emergence, then we can kind of track how do the turkeys respond to these cicada emergences and stuff. And then also, just by birding and going out and looking for birds that you see and reporting those birds to sites like eBird, ebird.com, you can help track response in some of these species. So just going out in the woods, if you're a birder, listening and looking for birds, and then reporting those to places like eBird where they can compile that data. Now, I will say it may be a little tough to hear the birds over the cicadas, so you may want to brush up on your birding by sight for this summer rather than birding by ear.
So Elizabeth, that brings another question up, is why are they so darn loud?
Well, so the majority of the noise that we're hearing is actually just from the male cicadas. So it's only about actually half the population of the cicadas making such a racket. The males are singing to attract a mate, and they're just trying to have the loudest, the best serenade to get the females to come over and click their wings in response. It's really interesting. So they're not actually, you say singing and you picture them having like a vocal cords and singing through their mouth like we might. But the cicadas actually have this organ called a timbal on the side of their body that you can think of like a plastic bendy straw. And when you take that bendy straw and you kind of stretch it back and forth, it makes a little sound. That's basically what the male cicadas are doing. And then their abdomens are almost entirely hollow. So they make their little bendy straw noise on the side of their body, and then that resonates in their hollow abdomen, almost like a violin or a guitar. And then that increases the volume of the sound. And actually, just pro tip for cooking cicadas, the males have less actual substance to them than the females, because the females have actual stuff in their abdomens, whereas the males have hollow abdomens. Yeah, not to just focus on cicada food, but just thought I'd mention that tip.
We have more tree questions for Lenny. So a lot of people really wanting to protect their trees. So first question, are frost cloths an acceptable barrier if people have those?
So really any type of covering that has a mesh that is less than a ½ inch across is going to be relatively effective at preventing the cicadas from accessing. If it's a wider mesh, the cicadas can sneak through that and won't be effective. And so I'll be honest, not being a nursery person, I'm not exactly sure what frost cloth is, but that's what you're looking for. That key part is what is the size of the mesh. So look at that, less than a ½ inch should be pretty effective. Bigger, not going to be effective. So that would be the main guidance on that.
And then next question, how long do I have to keep the netting on for?
The information I've seen, and Elizabeth can check me on this too, is probably like mid-June to late June, somewhere in that period. And I'm going
to. Yeah, so anywhere from mid-June to very early July, they're usually out for about a month and a half. And you can, I would say that if you keep track of the singing and you listen to that noise, then wait at least like a week to a week and a half, even 2 weeks if you can allow for that, after they've stopped making that loud racket. That's when it would be a good idea to take it off, because once they stop singing, that's when they're starting to die off, but there may be some females that are still out laying their eggs, because the mating's done at that point, but they still need to lay their eggs.
And finally, is it important to water our trees extra to compensate for the cicadas feeding off their roots or on the branches?
I would not worry about that unless we're in an actual drought. So once again, this is a relationship that has existed for millennia. Both the cicadas and the trees have co-evolved in this situation and manage very well together. It would only be a situation where perhaps you've got a newly established tree, or we're in a really significant drought, and then you would want to amend with water just to keep your tree healthy. But the cicadas really aren't a huge consideration in that.
So Elizabeth, we have a few friends for you in our Facebook page. Just throwing it out there, a couple suggestions. There's a book apparently called Cicadalicious, which comes from the University of Maryland with lots of recipes in it. Thanks, Bill, for the recommendation. And then Philip says you can actually try El Chirpo tacos or cicada stir fry, which are also from that book. So it's not just for cookies, y'all. You can make actual, I guess, regular food with it. So give it a whirl and let us know.
Elizabeth, I'll trust you on how they taste.
I will not be trying it, but Elizabeth is going to be our guinea pig.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I've also heard that you can barbecue them or do like a little skewer of cicadas, put some other like vegetables on there, put them on your barbecue.
Is it wings on or wings off?
Oh, that is a good point. You don't want the wings and you don't want the legs because those can be very kind of pointy in your mouth. It's the same thing is true of grasshoppers. If you eat a grasshopper and you leave the legs on, you all of a sudden get kind of like stabbed in your gums, which is not really a sensation most people enjoy. So yeah, you want to remove the wings, you want to remove the legs.
Good to know. One last question before we move on to some of the ways that people can get involved with cicadas. Is there significance to the cicadas cycle happening on a prime number like 11 or 13 or 17? Or is that just the way nature made them?
Not as far as I know, and I haven't seen any research as far as I know saying that the prime number is especially significant. It is more about escaping predation, and kind of there are two parts of that. So Jared already mentioned the predator satiation strategy, but also by only coming out every 17 years and having this huge long gap, it's harder for anything to really specialize on cicadas, which is those specialist parasitoids are what keep a lot of insect populations sort of low or in check. So their predator satiation strategy and it's avoiding specialization.
So Jared mentioned that we can help track with the turkey poult survey, and that link is in the comment section on Facebook for those of you interested in helping with that. But there's some other community science projects people can be involved in right now in terms of seeing the cicada emergence as it happens. So can you fill us in on some of those, Elizabeth?
Sure thing. So we are in Purdue Entomology. We have two projects running. One is a little bit more time intensive than the other. So the more time intensive option is we want to really track emergence timing at a local level to see if there's any variation between different local sites. So we're asking people to monitor a set of trees in their area. They can pick whatever trees they want and go out, check them every 3 days and record when the cicadas emerge. And I think Wendy has a link to where they can get more information for that she's putting in the chat. And for that one, also in the instructions, it says you have to start by May 1st, but really if you start, as long as you start before the emergence begins, you should be fine. The second thing is a little bit less time intensive, which is we're doing a cicada bio blitz. And we're doing that through iNaturalist. So with this, we're trying to gather both location data for cicadas as well as more general biodiversity data. To take part in that, you just need an iNaturalist account. And then to join our Indiana Cicada Fest project. And then from May 1st to 16th, at any point in that time period, pick a location that you want to spend some time outside, go outside and snap some pictures of all the living organisms in that area. So that could be plants, that can be fungi, that can be birds, whatever you want. Upload them to iNaturalist and it will be automatically added to our project. And for both of those, we will be sharing the results that we get in the future, as well as highlighting some of our the most interesting observations on our Purdue Entomology social media accounts. Oh, and I did also want to mention, if you just want to have some cicada fun, some cicada projects, if you go to our Bug Bowl website, we've got a wide range of different activities you can do around the emergence.
And we have a question, well, a couple of things. First of all, Bill mentions an app called Cicada Safari that people can use to track that. And then another question for Lenny, this one positive here. How do cicadas do with invasive species like autumn olive and honeysuckle? Can they kind of help us get rid of some of those invasives?
Unfortunately not. As I mentioned, yeah, no kidding. No luck on that front. The shrubs and the invasive shrubs in particular are very good at resprouting. And so they may potentially knock back some branch area, might reduce fruiting a little bit, but it's not going to be any kind of cure for invasive species. That's going to require the hard, diligent work of pulling, application of herbicides, and the other techniques that we talk about, the cicadas will not provide much assistance in that category.
Darn it, we could only hope. Another question, we've talked about trees, we've talked about animals. One thing we haven't talked about is crops. So Elizabeth, is that a threat for our agricultural friends, or are cicadas strictly tree people?
Just trees. There are occasional reports of a cicada getting really confused and trying to lay some eggs in something that's not a tree, but that's really rare to the point where it's not going to cause enough damage to be an issue. They are very focused in on trees. Again, I think this comes back to the confusion of that cicadas versus locusts question. I really wish people didn't use those interchangeably. I understand why they do, but it makes people panic and think there's going to be a plague of locusts destroying all the crops, when really it's mostly some the type of damage Lenny described to trees. So, and most trees will be okay.
So we've talked a lot about the negative effects of cicadas. Do they actually do positive things for our environment besides feed all of the wildlife that Jared told us about?
Yeah, so one of the things that they will do is actually when they die, their bodies fall to the ground and they'll decay. And so that is this huge input of resources into the soil. Sorry about the siren going by in the background. That is this huge input of resources into the soil for the plants in the understory and also for the trees at a time of year when they wouldn't usually get those sort of nutrients for them. Yeah, also people who like to go fishing often use them. That's less about the environment and more something that people can do, but that's a benefit as well.
You stole Jared's question. I was going to ask him about that. So Jared, tell us about the positives when it comes to recreating, when it comes to cicadas. It may make your journey a little noisier, but you may have some bait and maybe see some wildlife you wouldn't normally see as they are out trying to get some lunch.
Yeah, so on the fishing side, I haven't myself collected them for fishing, but I know people who collect them when they're abundant and then, maybe freeze them and use them later. But and I've heard reports of, people using them for trout fishing and things like that. So I think absolutely could be a fishing bait. A lot of them emerge on the ground. So you may have the opportunity to see some species of wildlife near the ground that you wouldn't, maybe some songbirds and things like that, maybe more visible as they crawl up the tree or as they are on the ground. But so I think they're going to maybe limit your ability to hear some of those birds, but, not really have any negative side of that. So.
Well, any other questions you have from the audience, go ahead and put those in the comment section on Facebook. We're going to start wrapping up here. But thanks to everyone for their input. So I guess, Lenny, let's start with the trees. What, where, when, how? What do I need to protect? When do I need to do it? And how do I do that effectively?
Yeah, the netting, insect netting is really your way to go. And that is only for trees that you really don't want to tolerate any kind of damage on, in areas where we're actually going to have cicadas. And on the recreation side, I would just say, if you don't have a bug phobia, consider going to one of the parks or forests in southern Indiana during this emergence. It's one of the most incredible events you're going to see. I'm the oldest person on this call, and I've been through 4 of them now, counting this one. And I will tell you that it's worth seeing. If you're not frightened of bugs, check it out. It's really something to be done.
So we protected our trees, fruit trees, everything deciduous. They don't help us with our invasives, sadly. Jared, talk to us about one more time about the wildlife. Do I need to do anything to help out my wildlife friends? Or should I just expect to see more of them and maybe notice that they're not eating some of the things that they normally have eaten on my property?
Yeah, so you probably won't notice a whole lot. They'll just be kind of going about their everyday thing, just eating cicadas instead of eating other things. So there's really not a whole lot you have to do. other than maybe go out in the woods and do some birding and try to look for birds and report that to eBird. Or if you're out in July and August driving around your property or driving around back and forth to work, anytime you see a hen turkey with or without her young, write that down and report it to the online turkey bird report portal, because that'll help the DNR track turkey production and see how it may impact turkey production. So there's really not a whole lot that you have to do. Just kind of get out in the woods and watch these cicadas come out. Someone asked me the question not too long ago about what kind of species eat cicadas. So there's actually been a lot of research into cicadas in Indiana. And, you have things like short-tailed shrews, which is a little small mammal. Something as small as those will eat cicadas, and you actually see a pretty big population increase in shrews. Raccoons will eat them, all kinds of small mammals, various bird species from kestrels to cuckoos, woodpeckers, even smaller songbirds will eat, like cardinals, even smaller will eat them as well. Snakes eat them. So basically if it eats an insect and can fit it in its mouth, it's probably going to eat cicadas. Even if it doesn't typically eat bugs, even things like coyotes will switch their diet. Coyotes are very opportunistic. So they'll, in normal years, they'll be eating lots of berries and plums if you have them, and apples and all that kind of stuff. Anything they can reach, they'll eat. So they're going to switch their diet to eating a lot of cicadas probably as well.
And then finally, Elizabeth, let's wrap up the people/animals part of it. Cicadas do not hurt people. They don't bite. They don't sting. They might give my dog an upset stomach. Can you talk a little bit about the domestic animals aspect of it? And if my dog happens to get a hold of a cicada, will he or she be okay?
Right. It's sort of the same as with people eating cicadas. There's nothing inherently toxic about the cicadas themselves, but there are two potential issues. So if your dog happens to eat a cicada that has insecticide on it, or it's been feeding on something with insecticides, that can be an issue. If it's like, a dying, rotting cicada, there might be some problems there. And then the other thing is that the exoskeleton of the cicada is really hard to digest. So if your dog eats a lot of cicadas, it might then have an upset stomach and it might throw up. And we do want to encourage people that, if they're worried about their dog, that consult a vet, because again, I'm an entomologist, I'm not a vet. So I always want to make sure that people are taking good care of their animals. But there's nothing inherently toxic about the cicada itself. It's just like a grasshopper or another insect it might be encountering in a normal summer.
And so we have a couple of final wrap-up questions from the audience. Diana wants to know, can cicada wasps handle the 17-year cicadas? She said they could handle the 13 years. So I don't know if you want to go briefly about cicada wasps and what effect they can have.
Yeah. So there's a type of wasp called a cicada killer that targets the annual cicadas that come out every year. They basically catch them, lay an egg in it, and then bury the wasp underground. Then the egg hatches and it's got this nice cicada meal that it can eat before it pupates and comes out as an adult wasp. So we don't know for sure, but we're guessing that an educated guess, that the life cycle of the cicada killers isn't going to overlap much with the 17-year cicadas. So a few of them might be caught by the cicada killers, but most of them will not be interacting with one another, because they do have that life. The cicada killers do have a life cycle that's really precisely timed for the annual cicadas that are coming out later in the summer. So they'll miss most of the 17-year cicadas that are coming out pretty soon.
And then last question, will there be an alert that this emergence is happening besides the obnoxious noise?
If you're talking about outside, in terms of just like knowing when they're coming out, the next thing to look for is the exuvia all over the trees. So those little exoskeletons. they're big enough that, I mean, there's a chance that there are some dragonflies you might get them mixed up with, but for the most part, it's definitely going to be a cicada if you see those. I should have grabbed, I've got a few of them that I saved from years ago from the annual cicadas, but they're too far away. Anyway, but people can also sign up. We have an email list that you can find a link to on our website, where we're going to send out updates and letting people know as we start to get reports of the cicadas emerging. My cat is caught on my shirt. There we go. Sorry about that. She was like pulling away. So if you sign up for the email list, we'll be sending out updates as the cicadas emerge. We promise not to send a ton of them. It'll just be the occasional email as things occur.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much. I think the audience learned a lot about what to do about their trees, what to do for wildlife, and then just general cicada facts. And please do not call them locusts for Elizabeth's sake. So thank you to all of you for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks on May 13th for our next Ask the Expert. We'll be joined by Mitch Ziske, and we're going to be talking about aquatic plant life. So what you need to know for your pond. And Jared may even chip in on that one. Who knows? He knows a lot about stuff. So thank you so much for joining us. If you have questions, obviously all of the things that we've talked about, the different projects you can get involved in, are in the Facebook links. So feel free to get involved and help us track this cicada emergence. So with that, thanks everybody.